Sometimes human rights abuses happen because laws aren't followed, but other times it's the laws themselves that are the problem. This video looks at the United States, the only country in the world where children can be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for crimes that they committed before the age of 18.
The sentence of life without the possibility of parole is a sentence to die in prison. There's no time off for good behavior, no opportunity to prove that you've become a different person. Next to the death penalty, there is no harsher condemnation. As the senator said, the United States stands alone in the use of this sentence.
That means I'm gonna die here.
In particular, the video explores the strategies that advocates in California used to influence legislators and eventually to change the law.
There were several big challenges that we knew, going into working on the issue. In the legislature, and I would say even more so in the legislature than in the general public, there was an attitude of the only way to respond to crime is to incarcerate. I'd say, in 2006, 2007, 8, 9, 10, there still was this fear for policymakers that they would be perceived as looking soft on crime. A just system has to have proportionality in terms of sentences. And when we're looking at children, we have to recognize that children and young people are different from adults, and the sentences should reflect that fact. When we first started working on it, our tactics were different than 5 and 6 and 7 years in. I mean, I think each year we failed, and each year we evaluated, what worked, what made sense, what were the messages and the messengers who could carry this water, who could describe to legislators sitting across the table who were afraid of looking soft on crime, who wanted to protect victims and communities from violent crime, and needed to be educated about the importance of treating children and youth differently from adults, as well as the limitations of incarceration as the only way to deal with crime, even serious crime. So I think the most important tactic that we relied on was interacting with legislators like they were human beings, and that they were coming to the table with personal experiences, the experiences of their constituents. We did a lot of meetings with legislators, and I would say, after the first year, we kind of maxed out with the how useful it was, say, for Human Rights Watch to go in and sit down and talk about the issue of life without parole. And we began building a coalition of people who were supportive of this issue and could bring to the table different perspectives. When you think about an issue like this, there really are different angles to look at it. There's the human rights angle. It's a practice that is unequivocally prohibited under human rights law. There's a fiscal angle. There's, an argument that it is not a fiscally wise use of money to lock up someone from age 14 until they die. There's not, there's a point at which that's not a good use of state dollars. There's a moral argument, there's a public policy argument, there's a scientific argument of development of young people. So there's many more arguments. There are public policy arguments of proportionality of sentencing and what really works to really protect public safety. We began to develop messengers, speakers who could bring each of those perspectives. And to some degree, we would sit down and look at a legislator and try to understand what his or her concerns were and bring messengers to that individual who would speak to those concerns. Most generally, who was the most effective? I would say two groups of people. And one was murder victim family members who could step forward and address that very valid concern that policymakers had of, if I vote for this alternative to life without parole, is that a vote against victims? Murder victim family members would sit down with legislators or testify in committee and say, yes, I want the person who killed my child to go to prison. However, when that person is a child themselves, when it's someone under the age of 18, I also want them to get a second chance. And both of those things can be true. And maybe even more so for victims, what we have in the United States is the reality that the people who bear the brunt of most violent crime are in poor neighborhoods that are also bearing the brunt of the effect of failed criminal justice policies. And so it's really not uncommon for murder victim family members, particularly people of color, to also have family members who have been treated unjustly in the criminal justice system. And in fact, it's not uncommon for family members to be on one weekend visiting a child who's been murdered, visiting their grave at a cemetery, and the next weekend going to visit a child who's been imprisoned. So these are individuals who have a very deep understanding of the effects of violence and failed criminal justice policies. They have a nuanced, complex understanding of what violence and wrong criminal justice policies do to us as a society. And those voices were not being heard at the Capitol. Another group who has broadly been very, very effective in communicating the importance of criminal justice policies that have an element of mercy, that have a focus of really offering people opportunities to turn their lives around, are formerly incarcerated people. And when we were focused in on the issue of life without parole, those individuals could say, I got a second chance. That light at the end of the tunnel, the possibility of parole, gave them the strength to focus their lives and to really focus on turning their lives around and becoming eligible for parole. Well, that was a very persuasive message. I think it's fair to say that traditionally at Human Rights Watch, our way of effective change has been to do high-level meetings. And so that's how we started out on this. And in the first year, I think we met with every single senator in California, and we met with the governor. And it quickly became clear that that was not going to be enough to create change on this issue. So we began reaching out to constituents of these policymakers and asking them to be involved and to write letters. And by the time we were through, literally thousands and thousands of people had written letters to their legislators. Hundreds of people had met, with their legislators, either in the district or had come in, to meet with legislators at the Capitol. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people actually made phone calls. There was a point where we were asked to tell our supporters to back off on the phone calls because they actually were clogging the lines. We felt like it was important to convey to legislators that this isn't just the interest of a number of advocacy groups, your constituents, and the opinion of the public at large is changing. There is a new understanding. And this is, in fact, what was happening at the time. There was a growing understanding of the developmental and neurological differences between teenagers and adults. We realized that this moral perspective was an important one that could reach a lot of people, and we began asking people of faith to come forward, and ultimately had a loose coalition of people of faith supporting this change, these laws. Out of our work with faith leaders, several things happened. One, ultimately a video was produced that had an imam, a Catholic priest, and a rabbi, I think were the three people who were in it, and each of them talking from their faith tradition and how their faith tradition led them to the belief that the sentence of life without parole for children was wrong. And that was very powerful. It was just beautiful.
When I first heard that children as young as 14 years old were sentenced to life in prison, it was like a physical shock to me that our society has deemed impossible to change, that our society has literally thrown away for life. And we're declaring to a child at 14, at 15, at 16, oh, you're done. You don't matter.
I firmly, deeply believe as a person of faith that my children are absolutely no different than those children who are sitting in those juvie halls in different places. What if it is my child? How would I react? Did I do enough? Can I do more? Can I ask someone else to do more?
In some ways, this is just as much a story of failure as it is a story of, ultimately passing a law, because, we started in 2006, and I think it was at the end of 2006 that we helped introduce the first bill to try to end the use of life without parole in California for youth. And that bill was almost immediately defeated. I mean, it didn't get out of committee. And then we worked on helping to introduce another bill, and that bill got out of committee, but it became really clear it wasn't going to pass on the Senate floor, and so we helped introduce another bill, and at that point we kind of went at it from a different angle. We had to think about it and come up with a way that wasn't outright eliminating life without parole, but instead was creating an avenue for resentencing. And that was a majority vote. And so we began introducing bills that were this kind of resentencing, putting the case back in front of a judge. And even that was difficult. And I think it was maybe in our third or fourth year, we got out of the House of Origin, which was the Senate, and then went to the lower house, which in California is called the Assembly. And with all of this heavy lifting going on, you know, thousands of phone calls, hundreds of people meeting with their legislators, you know, people of faith standing on the steps of the Capitol, you know, murder victim family members testifying, and just all this incredible array of individuals, hundreds of family members of youth who had been sentenced to life without parole, working on these issues, got all the way through the committees and to the final vote in the Assembly. And I'll never forget, you can't be on the actual Assembly floor, so it's this very ornate, building, and there's a balcony that goes above the Senate floor where, the Assembly floor, where the Assembly members are arguing about the bill. And a group of us sat there and watched as they argued about the bill, and this went actually into the middle of the night. And I think in that case, the argument went on for about an hour and a half, back and forth, back and forth. And when the final vote happened, we were 2 votes short of passage. And it was devastating. We filed out, we're, standing in the hallway. I think all of us were crying, and I was worried. I was worried about, what people were going to feel in prison. I was worried people would be suicidal, and I started getting calls from the family members, and I just thought, what am I going to say? I'm sorry, your kid's not going to ever get out. I wasn't sure that we were going to be able to go forward. And the calls that I started getting were people who were ecstatic. It was so counter what I expected, but people were, family members were, and by family members, I mean the people who were most directly affected by this, and the people on the inside were thrilled that we had gotten that far, and they felt like, let's go, let's do it again, and that was the response from our broader coalition, and so we started over, and got all the way back, went through the Senate, went through the Assembly, and again, sitting watching this vote. It was a year later, and we got all the way through and failed to pass by 1 vote. And at that point, I didn't know whether I could keep working on it. I didn't know if there'd be the funding, frankly, for me to keep working on it. I just didn't know. And we were able to rally again and move forward. In the fall of 2012, we were able to pass, and it passed by 1 vote. And then Governor Brown signed it into law. It was the first law of its type in the country. I was terribly worried about raising people's hopes and then having them dashed. And so it's a part of our research, I began communicating with people who were serving the sentence. I interviewed a number of them, I surveyed them, and I collected data about how California uses the sentence in other ways. But I also began communicating with them as we did the advocacy, and I would send periodic letters to everybody who was serving the sentence. And I would make a big point in every letter to say things along the lines of, don't get your hopes up. We're working, this is a really long road, I'm not sure if we can do this, maybe we'll win, maybe we won't, so please don't get your hopes up. And a little while in, several of them wrote me and said, one guy in particular wrote me, and I remember he said, Ms. Calvin, every letter you tell us not to get our hopes up. And I understand that, and I understand where you're coming from. And I understand that we might not win, but I don't think that you understand how powerful hope is. And in some ways, it doesn't matter if we win, because the very process of Human Rights Watch having stepped in here has told us that we are worth something. And I, he said, have gone from feeling like I was a crumpled up piece of paper in a wastebasket, and feeling instead that I'm a piece of paper that someone is taking out on a desk and smoothing out and opening up. And even if you lose, our lives are changed.